Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. We need all that we can get. All right, we got one bill on the agenda for today for a hearing only. Senate Bill 429, Chairman Dolezal. Welcome, sir. Thank you for being here. See if we can...
Mr. Chair, if it'd be okay with you, I'd like to have Brad Vaughn with Lieutenant Governor's Office join me in presenting this bill, if that would be agreeable. Thank you all for hearing this bill today. I'm working off of, first of all, Senate Bill 429, which is the Small Business Protection Act. I'm working off a Senate bill as it passed the Senate, which is 429 FA. We did have a floor amendment that I can tell you about, which is the FA that's denoted here. But this bill, Mr. Chairman, is really the centerpiece of the Lieutenant Governor's red tape rollback plan. I know in the Senate, we join with you in the House in a desire to ensure that Georgia remains the #1 state to do business. And one way that we believe that we can do that is by keeping the regulatory mechanisms in check, specifically empowering small businesses to grow in the state. And so really this is a multi-pronged bill that looks to put guardrails around the expansion of regulations. It looks to empower the General Assembly in the rulemaking process in terms of oversight. And it looks to ensure that small businesses are recognized for what they are. We changed the number of small business in code from 100 to 300, which is one of the ways we do that. But I'll walk you through this because it is a pretty substantial bill. And I think that given the fact that you said we're the only bill today, hopefully you've got about 5 minutes for me to walk you through this. Lines 26 through 92 in the bill that's in front of you creates what's called a small business impact analysis. And this analysis will estimate the economic cost and benefit that a bill will have on a small business, including the cost of providing goods and services, the availability and cost of workers, industry competition and consumer choice, and potential compliance costs. This, I would say, is very akin to a fiscal note, which we are all very familiar with. The change that was made on the floor, we did on behalf of the department to limit what can happen during session, because we do require these to be completed within 10 days while we're in session. And so we made it such that in the original version of the bill, every member of the General Assembly could request a small business impact analysis. We limited that to a committee chairman. Outside of session, anyone can make that request. If you do have to request a small business analysis on a bill, and in that period of time that we're outside of session, they have 30 days to deal with it. If you go down the lines 94 through 130, this really deals with proposed agency regulations and rulemaking. This requires notices of rulemaking contain a little bit more information than they contain right now. We really want them to look at the economic impact of the proposed rule, and that includes a number of things that we will have them include. An estimate of the number of individuals and businesses that would be subject to the proposed rule, the projected reporting, record keeping, and other administrative costs and time required for compliance with the proposed rule, including the types of professional skills necessary for the preparation of any documents, records, or reports that will be required by the proposed rule. A statement on the probable effect of the rule on the impacted individuals and businesses. And then lastly, other provisions or information to assess the economic impact of the proposed rule. The thinking here, Mr. Chairman, is that as these rules are being introduced, we want the agencies to submit to us what they think the impact of that will be, as opposed to just kind of rolling the rule out and giving us the legal jargon of what the rule does. So this is really a way to empower the General Assembly in the process. As I mentioned before, on line 143, we really just expand the definition of a small business from 100 employees to 300 employees. And we add a little bit of language there as well that allows the agencies to reduce the economic impact of proposed rules on small businesses in particular, by establishing reduced compliance or reporting requirements, or differing, and you'll see that language there, differing compliance timetables for small businesses. Next, really one of the larger sections of this bill is lines 185 to 263. And this looks at the legislative review process of proposed agency regulations. As you know, Mr. Chairman, right now there's a process by which the legislature has the ability to review proposed rules, but this really strengthens our ability and gives us the ability to review, delay, or block the implementation of proposed rules. Notice of proposed rulemaking and regulations are currently assigned to the committee of both the House and Senate for review. Under this bill, if the assigned committees object to a proposed rule, the rule will be deemed to not have been adopted by the agency and will be deemed withdrawn unless the agency, within the first 15 days of the next regular session of the General Assembly, transmits written notification to the chairperson of the ejecting committees that the agency does not intend to withdraw the rule. And then we really go into this kind of review process. Their notification must include a detailed statement setting forth the basis for the necessity of the proposed rule. And then we have a process by which both chambers of the General Assembly, with a 2/3 vote, can overrule the proposed rule. And we have some language in there on the days that can happen. That needs to be done between the 15th and 30th day. And really this empowers the General Assembly to be in the driver's seat if we want to overrule a rule, which we could of course do specifically by statute, but this would be in really a response to the rule that came in. Lines 269 to 301 they actually do put two separate dates in which rules go into effect, but what we're attempting to do with that is really to have kind of clarity so that we don't have this consistent onslaught of rules, but rules that are proposed the first half of the year will go into effect on July 1st. Rules that are proposed in the second half of the year will go into effect on the first of the year. Not all that different from laws that we see happen. We have specific dates that, unless otherwise stated, laws go into effect. We're looking to do a similar thing with rules. Lastly, on lines 308 to 361, we introduced a comprehensive rolling review of agency regulations. This is really, if you're familiar with the concept of zero-based budgeting, that we're borrowing from that. We've loosely in the Senate called this zero-based rulemaking, where we put every agency on a 7-year cycle in which their rules will be reviewed. If their rules in that 7-year, when their 7-year period comes up, if their rules have grown by less than 10%, they are exempt from that rulemaking process. But if their rules have grown by more than 10%, we essentially have them establish and make the case for the necessity of those rules. So in a review year, an agency must analyze each of its rules and regs and create a written report or analysis. The report must consider the following: whether the benefits sought to be achieved by the rule or regulation are being realized and are in compliance with current law, whether such benefits justify the cost of implementing and complying with the provisions of the rule or reg, and whether there is less restrictive and less costly alternatives to accomplish the desired benefits or results. We have a public input process that will be part of this. We state that they must do this by critical review. And then ultimately we have language in there that we think is important that says that if possible, if there are less onerous, costly, or more effective alternatives to such rules and regs, and without determining whether such rules and regs are actually necessary. So we're kind of having them reestablish and ensure that what can become an ever-growing set of regulations that we're having to live under gets reviewed, and ultimately hoping to keep the administrative process somewhat in check, and that they're only doing what needs to be done, and that we don't have rules and regs sitting on our books that are not accomplishing their originally desired intent. So, Mr. Chairman, I know it's a lot. I'm happy to answer any questions about this bill, and certainly appreciate your consideration today.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Questions from the committee. Representative Jasmine Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I'm very curious. I see that the first section of the bill really does pertain, Section 2.1 seems to really focus on small businesses. But then as I look through the remainder of the bill, it seems like this applies to every agency and department in the entire state. Is that correct?
So certainly this is a multi-pronged bill, and thank you for the question. We do introduce this concept of the small business impact analysis, which I didn't catch when you made it in, but really you can think of that as a fiscal note for small business, but really as it relates to the regulatory environment. And then yes, we do bring all agencies under what I referenced most recently, which is the zero-based rulemaking piece of the equation of this bill.
Follow-up question. So I also wanted to ask about all the different reports and audits that this is calling for. Is there any concern with a lot of our departments and agencies being short-staffed? Like today, we talked about attrition issues for a lot of our departments and things like that. Is there any concern that this might be burdensome to our departments and agencies, and like in a weird irony, we are trying to deregulate things by kind of over-regulating our
Sure.
departments?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that I would answer that question in two separate ways. First, we did have consultation with OPB and Department of Audits and Accounts on the small business impact analysis. Secondly, the agencies are currently, when they're doing their rulemaking, I think that we would all like to think they're considering the impact already of what those rules would be. All that we're doing is asking them to put that in the notification of when they make that rule. And then lastly, as it relates to the zero-based rulemaking piece of this, one, it happens every 7 years. But two, my hope would be that the bulk of the agencies in this state, that their regs are not growing more than 10% a year, and they would be exempted from that anyway. And for those that are, then they would have to walk through this process, which I don't think is an overly onerous process. And in the vetting in the Senate, the hearings that we had, we did not hear back from any agencies that were pushing back on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I would only add to that, particularly for the pieces in regard to proposed regulations. Currently, committee chairmen get these things via email regularly throughout the off season, throughout the session. A lot of those are very dense. They're very sort of technical oriented. It's very hard to sort of sometimes piece through exactly what's trying to be accomplished through some of those. And a lot of that really sort of, I think, causes the General Assembly to maybe sort of pass by some of those things and not really understand what's being done. So what we see this as is as much a transparency measure so that anybody receiving those communications, whether during session or not, is at least on a little bit more notice about what the rule is trying to accomplish. So I would just supplement that to Chairman Dolezal's comments.
Thank you, sir.
For those of y'all that joined late, this is Brad Vaughn from the Lieutenant Governor's Office, if you have not had the chance to meet Brad yet. Yeah.
Representative Campbell.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. I've been a small business owner in Georgia for almost 20 years, maybe almost 30, and currently own a small business. And so I think policies and resources to help small business are absolutely a priority. And this is a really, as you said, dense bill. And so I do have a number of questions. And I think kind of echoing what Representative Clark mentioned, given that this is very broad and impacts all agencies, so that would, I want to affirm, include Department of Health, Department of Education, Department of Elections, in addition to all the licensing boards, grant associations. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And so again, thinking about the process of review and thinking about resources, in every single one of our committee meetings and in our budget meetings, we're hearing from our departments about resources. So to me, that is a red flag that I would certainly want to understand further. And I'm curious to know if in that spirit, there is a fiscal note for this bill that's been requested or shared.
No, first of all, thank you for that question. There's not a fiscal note, and I think largely fiscal notes tend to happen when there's either an appropriation, a change to the taxation policy of the state, not necessarily a change to what may be either a new allocation or reallocation of effort from within departments. I don't even, as I contemplate how you would do a fiscal note for such a thing, I don't even know how the department might even contemplate doing that. Largely because this would be using existing resources that are within the department conceivably. And again, if you happen to be in a department that has changed your regulations in the 7 years by that 10%, you hit that threshold. I think that's probably largely what you're asking about, if I understand your question correctly. That would be something that would be an allocation of interdepartment resources as opposed to something that would be a change to tax policy or an expense by the state.
And if I could ask kind of a further clarifying question there. So if I'm understanding also the way that the process would work, for each department, what you've laid out here would basically promulgate that each department, all rules and regulations would be zeroed out at their time of review. Every single rule and regulation would have to be justified and have to be not just new rules and regulations,
Right.
but from the inception of the department. And
Right.
they would be zero, sorry, just want to
No,
make
go
sure I'm
ahead, sorry.
understanding clearly, in the same analogy that you've used for zero-based budgeting, in effect, it would zero out all rules and regulations for, let's say, the Department of Health.
No, I think that's a fair reading of that, ma'am. The idea being there is that if you're on a 7-year cycle for doing something like that, you could conceivably have gone, at least in recent terms, almost through an entire gubernatorial administration without having a top-down review of what a department is doing. And so the idea is that you're not making people do this on a yearly basis or even a biennial one. It's that on a 7-year cycle that, frankly, the executive branch would be free to sort of set on its own in this plan. It's giving at least some check throughout that time period where it says a department needs to evaluate, really, as I see it for this, not only what its mission is, but the way that it's going about accomplishing that. And I think the reporting that's coming out of that is really saying, are we simply doing things because we've always done them? And are we simply doing those things because we've always done them that way? I think that's really sort of a concept with a lot of the things that are sort of underlying this bill is if you've gone throughout an entire administration or through basically in some circumstances here almost an entire decade, the mission of an organization might have changed. The circumstances under which previous rules were promulgated might have changed. We want to give at least some nudge in the direction of a department needing to really, in that circumstance, evaluate what it's doing and why, and really force the conversation of why do we do things that we do. And to sort of your earlier point on that, that may be a time-consuming experience, that may be a costly experience, but it may in the long run also allow a department to look around and say, we have resources and regulations that are doing things that we really don't need to be doing or that really are not justified by either current needs or current policy. And so it's intentionally written in an open-ended, flexible way in that regard, so that an individual department, the commissioner of a given department, has the authority to look at those things, certainly in consultation with the General Assembly, with the appropriations committees, whoever their stakeholders are there, to arrive at what that department's mission actually ought to be.
And so it would be accurate then to think about this really as a bill setting up the review and audit of all departments within the state of Georgia.
I think that's a fair characterization of that, but self-driven by those, excuse me if I'm not catching the microphone, but self-driven by those departments rather than from an external source. I think that's really the key, is that it's the department on a schedule sort of saying to themselves, these are our rules and this is what we believe our rules should be, putting those rules out for notice and public comment and doing those things that they would normally be doing for any kind of new rulemaking, but doing that on a schedule.
And then everything within that review process, every rule and regulation would be subject to legislative approval. And then further, if I'm understanding the sentiment here, any new rule that a department might want to make or need to make, let's just say it's for food safety or it's for driving speeds or health issues, would come before the legislature. There would be zero independent decision-making from an operational perspective for any department within the state of Georgia?
Well, and I would point to you now that, frankly, that's currently the circumstance that we have. I mean, we have a Legislative Review Act that's currently in effect. If you are a committee chairman in the General Assembly, you probably are a regular recipient of notices of proposed rulemaking, notices of proposed regulation for anything that's being changed like that. The process that we have now, that's sort of the more general process, is really, frankly, not being changed a great deal by this. What we have sort of proposed for this is the process that's used for regulations of the Department of Community Health, and that's sort of been grafted into 50-13-4 in the Administrative Procedure Act. But that's an authority that the General Assembly has now. For anything that is proposed, it's just not one that's utilized very often. And so I would say we are not making some of the things in this seem sweeping, but we are not really in that regard making much of a sea change. It's just not a process that the General Assembly utilizes very often.
Thank you for that answer. It does, in my view, and this reading does seem sweeping and enormous in terms of the intensity of resources. So that to me is something I'd like to explore and understand a little bit further, and understand what resourcing would be required to do that statewide, and what impact, to the earlier answer, would that have on our department's budgets, which ultimately will come back to us in terms of the general fund and appropriations. I have a few more questions, if just maybe one.
Let us get to someone else.
Sure.
And then we'll come back to you for my thank you, ma'am. Vice Chairman Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I love this bill. Thank you so much for bringing it. Excuse me. I've just got a couple little questions as a small business owner, and I appreciate anything we can do to get the rules off our backs, which I feel like are death by 1,000 cuts sometimes. So I think it's very important. One thing, the first thing that popped in my head was the idea, would it be okay, or think about exempting the federal rules, right? So if we get a new program or a new grant that has its own rules that we have to follow in order to receive the funds, if the feds change their rules, then our departments are going to have to change their rules, even with existing programs. The other thing is, would this include like hunting seasons every year? Like when the DNR changes the turkey season, that's a rule. So I'm just throwing, you don't have to answer, I'm just throwing some stuff out there. And then if there's a new program created, would that not count in the 10%? So what if we tell, GDOT to change all their bridges, the sign postings at their bridges, which we did recently.
Hypothetically, of course.
Hypothetically, of course.
We would never consider such.
But that would be a consideration as well. So if we force a 10% increase in somebody's rules, we may want to back off on that. And again, that's what my other question was, like, do new laws count within that 10% as well? So there's just some things to think about, but I appreciate y'all bringing the bill.
Well, and I'll tell you, I would have to look back, but I suspect that whenever the DNR regulations relating to hunting season come out, at least 2 committee chairmen in our building are getting notice of that right now. If I'm wrong about that and somebody points it out, I will take correction, but I believe those are exactly the type of rules for which we receive notice. A 30-day notice comes along. If chairmen take action, they do. Regularly, they do not.
Right. And I get those sometimes. I read them all, believe it or not, because I really try to pay attention to this stuff. That's why I like the bill. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And I don't know if Brad wants to answer your federal question. On the new program question, I think that's a great consideration. If that's something the committee wants to consider, I think that's you uncovered something that is certainly worth exploring. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Representative Clark.
Oh, it already circled back to me? Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I am listening to this, and I agree with some of the statements that were made by my colleagues. I'm very curious because I feel like when we give things titles, those should mean something. And so, this is called the Small Business Protection Act, or I can't find the Small Business Protection Act of 2024, but it seems to me like Section 2.1 is the only part that really pertains to small businesses. Would you all entertain an amendment that really just focuses on that first part? Because I feel like this second part, when we're talking about literally changing the way we do rules and regs for every department in the state, is completely different from let's do something to make it easier on our small businesses in our state.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that really, if you look at the totality of the regulatory environment and the general rulemaking that is made, the notification of rules, the burden of those certainly can be felt acutely by large businesses, but I think that large businesses have the ability to absorb those sometimes in a more less impactful manner than small businesses. I think there's probably a lot of small business owners in the room. I am one as well, and own a couple of different companies. One that currently is over 100 employees and would not be captured in the current small business definition, which we change in here, and then a couple that are well under that. And I know that we seem to constantly be chasing our tail, trying to keep up with these regs that maybe were not even intended for a small business, but that we get somehow ensnared in. So I think that really changing the culture of or ensuring, I should say, that the culture of the rulemaking environment in the state when it comes to the agencies has an eye towards both the regulatory burden and the expense as it relates to small businesses in particular is of acute value. And so I think that this zero-based rulemaking piece of this really is a cornerstone of what we're trying to do here, which is to ensure that we do maintain and control the growth of what sometimes seems like is an ever-growing administrative state, both federally certainly and then in the state as well.
All righty, Ms. Campbell?
Now it's on. So a couple of other questions. On lines, I think, let's see, 156. Sorry. Nope, that's not the right. Oh, yes, it is. Lines, 156 through 162-ish related to charitable organizations. Can you explain that section a little bit to give us an understanding of kind of what the intent is there?
Existing code.
Yeah. And Representative, I would only point out that that is existing law in 156 to 162. That's currently in the Administrative Procedure Act. I think the idea there, and I'd have to go back and look because I haven't focused on this piece, but that is largely a piece designed for, and I don't want to speak out of turn on this because I've not really focused in on this point, but essentially saying any kind of annual filing requirements that you might have as a charitable organization, it's sort of putting a balancing test on an agency to determine whether or not you've got an actual need or an interest to have a charitable organization make, I give as a hypothetical, 4 filings a year rather than 2. If an agency can get by and get the information that they need with 2 filings, with one in January, one in July, can we live with that rather than making them file something every month at great expense or particularly time? And I think that's sort of a theme throughout some of the other pieces. And frankly, a lot of this stuff is existing law. Some of the provisions that Senator Dolezal talked about in terms of having differing requirements for small businesses, we're really just changing the threshold in a lot of ways about what size of a company might qualify for that type of differing treatment. Because we already recognize in 1513-4 that regulatory agencies throughout the state can treat a small business differently, and we're really just sort of refining those requirements, in my mind, really around the edges of what that means.
So the impact of changing the size of small business could impact not-for-profits, and in this scenario, if I'm reading this correctly, that there could potentially be a situation where there would be no filing or reporting requirements.
I'd have to think about whether or not an organization covered under the Charitable Solicitations Act would really be a small business under the definition. I'll confess I've not thought about what that really means in context here, so I don't want to speak without really having thought that through. I think the idea and the parts earlier in the page are really more what I was referencing, where you're talking about clarifying or consolidating compliance requirements or things like that for for-profit businesses, and that's what we're really thinking about here.
Okay, and that would be great clarification to understand, because I think it just says business, not for-profit or not nonprofit.
Well, and the only thing I would point back to, those are in sort of separate subparagraphs of the
Yes.
code. So Part 3 is really sort of the small business piece. Part 4 really goes directly to charitable. And so reading it from just a purely textual standpoint, I'm not sure that lines 146 to 151, those seem to point back to the small business piece rather than pointing down to the charitable piece. Just on a reading as I sit here with all of you looking at me, that's how I read that.
Understand. No pressure.
I would add to that as well. Really, if you look at line 146, we really just changed differing to reduce and inserted and differing as it relates to timetables for small businesses. I think that's really still capturing the essence of what the original intent was. If I'm trying to read into what the original intent was, we wanted to clarify that. So really all that we're doing is changing, largely all that we're doing is changing that number from 100 to 300, and we're not touching anything as it relates to the charitable organization specifically.
I do have a couple more. I mean, it's a big bill.
Quickly, it is, and we are on a time crunch.
All right.
We have another committee meeting after this, so.
Thank you. Lines 26 through 30-ish. So this, again, I think is pertaining to the small business analyses and requests, and it in some ways looks like it mirrors some of our other policies, but I am curious. It says in line 26, prior to the convening of a session, and specifies who can request these analyses, and then it says following the convening of a session, who can request these analyses, and it seems to indicate that during session, no one could request these analyses. It's before, prior to, and following.
The lawyers wrote this language. When all else fails, blame the lawyers. But certainly, and we actually worked with OPB on this, and certainly the intent of this is to recognize that during session they can have an onslaught. So what we have is this broader allotment of who can request the small business impact analysis outside of session. And then once session has started, we narrow that down to essentially the executive branch and the committee chairman, which mirrors what's currently allowed for the fiscal notes as well.
So maybe the intention is during.
Yes, that's correct. And I'll have to look, but I can get back to you. I think that actually mirrors the language of our fiscal note statute, but if that was the intent, was to mirror essentially the time frame and how our rules typically speak to the period of the session.
Yeah.
So.
And then I have one other idea that for your consideration in terms of aiding our small businesses and entrepreneurs. I think when I talk to small businesses in my district and when I look at all the research out there, one of the biggest barriers, what I don't often hear about, which I think is to the credit of all of us, is that Georgia is a really favorable place to do business. So I have kind of a question and a statement. It would be interesting to understand if there would be a more narrow way to focus the intention here to specifically address those areas of burden versus all departments within the state, where many of our departments may not have any impact on small businesses. And then the second thing that I would kind of offer up is access to capital and financial resources often is one of the biggest barriers to entrepreneurs and small businesses. And I'm wondering if there are any ideas that we might include if the goal is to support and protect small businesses in the first part of this section that would support that.
Don't completely follow your second question. I can speak to what we've been trying to do on our side of the building on the first. So as Senator Dolezal alluded to when we first started, this is sort of part of a larger initiative, and I know that the House has been active in this regard, and I know generally speaking the building is very focused broadly on what we can do to support and protect small businesses. So I preface everything I'm about to say with that. We have been looking on the Senate side at a lot of work relating to occupational licensing, a lot of things like that deal with barriers to entry, that create paperwork, that deal with this is a fee that's got to be filed, this is an opportunity that this person has to go obtain continuing education. We see those broadly as very important fixes for particular industries or particular professions. Mm-hmm. And I think we've done some work that you all are seeing now come over into your committees that go to a lot of exactly what you just mentioned, is how can we in an individual and a very granular level make it easier for somebody who wants to start a business or change professions or obtain a higher level of certification, do that faster, more cheaply, with less education, if less education is not called for, is really what I would say to that. So again, contextualizing this in the broader context of what we have been trying to work on, we see this as a way to sort of reorient or to really focus rulemaking from a basic level on what impact is this going to have on literally the person who has to sit down and fill out the form, or hire an accountant, or hire a lawyer to do those things, and doing this in really the macro sense in a way that some of what I just mentioned is more focused on specific professions or specific industries. But having our executive branch, when necessary, take the time to think through how are we going to actually be impacting somebody who doesn't have access to a major law firm or a Big Four accounting firm to do their work for them, or doesn't have access to a team of lobbyists that can come be in this building on their behalf. That's who this bill is targeting and who is trying to protect, are people that don't have those resources. So if we're talking about access to capital broadly means access to the assistance of professionals and people who are very expensive. Absolutely. And who bill their time by the hour. That's one of the ways that I think this bill is trying to help those people.
And in that spirit, I'm wondering again if there is an opportunity to really narrow the focus of the bill to those types of departments that really do fall into that criteria versus all. Is a thought for consideration.
Thank you, ma'am. Representative Lumpton.
Thank you. Here I am. Hi. Two quick questions, and I'm relatively new, so everybody else may understand this, and I don't, but I'm going to ask it anyway. There are several lines that refer to the governor or the designee of the governor. The designee of the governor, is that someone that's just understood within the rest of the code as, oh, this is a governor's designee? Or are there any regulations around who that designee can be?
That I will say, and Mr. Tate, who is our counsel in the room, can correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's a fairly ubiquitous formulation in our
Okay.
code. We
Yeah.
often will allow either a commissioner or some other executive officer to not necessarily fulfill certain duties, but may designate a subordinate to do so. That I think that's purely what's contemplated.
Yeah, that's fine. I just didn't understand if this was something that was understood by everybody. And it seems like that's what you're saying it is. It's just an understood sort of thing. And I mean, you can't live with them, can't live without them. One more is that this, I don't read it this way, but I'm just making sure. This does not have anything to do with county level regulations or laws, local regulations or laws. This is just what's happening at the state
If
level.
someone pointed out to me that it did, I think we would get out of that business as
Right,
soon as
pretty
humanly
quickly.
possible.
Yeah.
Yes, we have no interest in interfering with that through this bill.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Representative Yurda.
At the proper time, I'd like to make a motion that we do pass Senate Bill 429.
To me, it's just a hearing only.
Okay.
So, thank you for that.
But thank
though.
you, your assistance is noted, sir. Come see us after the thank you.
Representative
So.
Did you call me? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question is about the emergency rule provisions.
I'm sorry, I didn't see where you're coming from.
Oh, no, over here. No problem. So around line 280, the emergency rule provisions. So when I think about emergency rules, I'm thinking about, highly particular situations where there's an emergency in place and we need to have a state agency or department with a specific subject matter expertise make a quick decision in the interest of the public. But it seems what we're doing here is we're putting a layer of regulation over that and having someone else approve, the governor in this instance. So I'd just like to know what was your thought behind that? What's the purpose behind that section of the bill?
Well, the only piece of that, so a little bit of what has been done here, and I want to give a nod to our legislative counsel for doing this. So if you're reading from 279 to 288 or thereabout, I would refer you back to the bottom of page 8.
Okay.
So a little bit of what we have tried to do there is to clarify in this piece emergency rulemaking, which is currently provided under law. So if you read those two pieces there that have been moved over, in general, I think, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong for this, but I think that's the idea there, is to just sort of transpose and clarify these pieces into this section rather than having them further up in the bill.
So are you saying that this bill doesn't impose a new requirement that the governor must now sign off on
Let me-
emergency rulemaking?
Yeah, I think that's a fair reading. And again, thank you for pointing that out. I don't
Sure.
know that I had really considered that particular perspective on that. Let me answer another question about that for you another time, if you don't mind. Yeah. I'll
We'll get
back
you
to
an
that.
answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Representative Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just out of curiosity, I may have missed it since I was a little late coming in. If the federal level refers to small business, anything under 500, why did you go to 300? Just curious. Employees.
To be honest, there are, I think, competing definitions for small business out there. If I recall, that one was drawn from at least one small business association memorandum that I had read that designated them as 300. I think 500 is used sometimes, 300 is used sometimes. 500 seemed like just personally a lot, and a big change from 100 where we've designated them there. I'd have to look back to my notes to see why we chose that particular one, but I believe it was from some small business administration memorandum that we were reviewing.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, we have one individual signed up to speak to the bill. Mr. Taylor Hawkins, you'll come to the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First time addressing your committee, so I appreciate the chance to do so. My name is Taylor Hawkins with Frontline Policy Council. One of the things we did last year was launch a small business representation organization called the Frontline Conservative Business Alliance. And what we aim to do there is to represent not just small business, but primarily small businesses from across Georgia. And so we have several hundred members already and growing that. And just wanted to take the opportunity to fully endorse this piece of legislation. We think that the impact that it will have will be tremendous for small businesses, and just ensuring that the proper accountability exists for the regulation and the regulatory bodies that have a tendency to grow. And again, not necessarily in a negative or nefarious way, but just doing the things that they have done because they have always done them in a way that can negatively affect small businesses. I myself have been a small business owner for the last 10 years, ever since high school, and know greatly the degree to which that can affect very small businesses. And so just appreciate the work of the Lieutenant Governor's office, want to fully commend it to this body, and on behalf of the Frontline Conservative Business Alliance, want to urge this committee to pass SB 429.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate those comments. Mr. Yurda? Vice Chairman Fry.
I just had a question for the presenter or the speaker. If this is, just curious, has this been done in any other states? Do we have any examples of this policy being implemented where there was a positive outcome or a negative outcome?
Go ahead if you want to jump in. So a couple of things on that. So the particular model for the 1513-4 that you see, which is really sort of the Legislative Review Act, is actually current law in Georgia as it relates to the Department of Community Health, if I'm not speaking out of turn on that. This was drawn specifically from the Title 31 rulemaking provisions there, and that frankly has been upheld by our Supreme Court, which was why we chose that particular one. It's been blessed as not violating separation of powers, other things like that. The sort of zero-based rulemaking, the sort of 2 dates a year and other things like that, I believe Idaho is a model for those. It's been implemented as a change there. If I remember my notes from that correctly, I believe there's been a fairly substantial reduction in regulation from that. If Senator wants to speak to that.
Idaho actually currently requires a reduction of their rules by 10% every 7 years. So under the reading, this bill, you could actually you could come out of your rulemaking review, your zero-based rulemaking, with more rules than you went in. It's not necessarily the intent, but that could happen. That's contemplated in this bill. You come out with the exact same amount, you can come out with less, but Idaho actually reduces theirs by 10% every 7 years. So they go in with 100 rules, they can only come out with 90. So we kind of took the spirit of that, but did allow for much more latitude within the agencies to contemplate what rules they deemed worth keeping.
Representative, the only other piece that I would add, the small business impact analysis provisions of the bill are actually based on something that the state of Maryland does. They actually have that, I think, frankly, as a default mechanism for almost all legislation that comes through the Maryland General Assembly, rather than it being the kind of option that somebody would select. There is a sort of memo that's attached to the back of the bill. The auditor makes sort of a small business impact yes or no. And if the answer is yes, there's a description that comes alongside that. And so I was intrigued to see that was not only something that somebody could ask for, but that something is literally a feature of every bill that's considered there. So I just offer those as simple examples of what we've seen.
Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions quickly from members of the committee? We're up against a time crunch. We got another committee meeting that's meeting in here after this. Any other comments at this time? All right. Mr. Chairman, thank you. We are adjourned.
Thank you.